Recording.
My mother-in-law recently lost her beloved German Shepherd, Samson. They shared many, many wonderful years together, and this is an especially tough time for her. So, I wanted to make her something special. Since she spends a lot of time up at her cottage on the lake, I thought a wind chime for the porch might be the perfect thing. And today, I'm taking you with me through the full build, from laser cutting and engraving to prepping the wood with conditioner, stain, and weather sealant, then creating a beautiful UV resin ocean wave wind catcher, and finally, the complete wind chime assembly. By the end, you'll know exactly how to make your very own wind chime and learn some practical techniques that can help on future projects too. There's a lot packed into this video, and I really think you'll be glad you stayed. So, grab a cup of coffee and settle in. I really appreciate you spending part of your day here with me. Let's get started. Making a wind chime design is actually pretty simple. You really only need three main parts: the base at the top, the clacker in the center, and the wind catcher at the bottom. You can make the parts in any shape you want. The most important part of the design is the spacing for the hanging cords. On the top base piece, all of the holes need to be evenly spaced and positioned at the same distance from the center so the chimes hang balanced. Once you have your layout figured out, the rest is mostly customizing the wind catcher, deciding what materials you'll need, and planning out all of the decorative details. Here we are at my finishing station. I'm using Baltic birch for my wind chime. Since I didn't tape the wood before cutting and engraving, I have some flash off and smoke residue to clean up. But I'd recommend doing a light sanding on birch or basswood either way. Even when the surface looks smooth, the grain can still have small raised fibers and inconsistencies that really pop out once stain, paint, or finish is applied. A quick sanding helps even things out, smooths the surface, and gives you a much cleaner finish. Next, I'm applying a preconditioner before I stain the wood. I learned this trick after dealing with many uneven and rough-looking finishes on softer woods, and I haven't skipped this step since. Wood conditioner helps the wood absorb stain more evenly, which cuts down on patchy dark spots. It also helps reduce the fuzzy, raised grain look that can show up after finishing. It's an extra step, but it makes a big difference in the final look and feel of the piece. After applying conditioner, you'll want to let it sit for at least 15 minutes, and most manufacturers recommend staining within 2 hours. The conditioner is designed to partly seal the wood so the stain absorbs more evenly, but if you wait too long, it starts acting more like a sealer and keeps the stain from penetrating the wood. So, this is one of those steps where you definitely don't want to wander off and binge an entire season of your favorite show before coming back to stain. Now it's time to apply the stain. Make sure you give it a really good stir before you start. A lot of the pigment settles to the bottom of the can, and if you skip this step, your color can end up looking completely different from one piece to the next. Blue shop towels are usually my go-to for applying stain. They hold the stain really well, but also allow me to control how much I'm using and make it easy to wipe away the excess without leaving lint behind. They're also disposable, which is important because you don't want random stain rags lying around, especially if you're using oil-based stain. Also, I highly recommend wearing gloves for this part unless you want stained fingertips for the next 3 days. I usually stain both sides at the same time to help cut down on dry time. Then I set the pieces on top of microfiber towels to dry. I found that microfiber hasn't interfered with the finish, for me at least, and it keeps the pieces from sticking to the table or picking up random debris while the stain dries. After staining, you'll want to give the pieces at least a full 24 hours to dry before moving on to the next step. Even if the surface feels dry to the touch sooner, the stain underneath can still be wet. And since our next step is engraving, that's especially important with an oil-based stain. If the stain hasn't fully dried, the heat from the laser can create extra smoke, residue, uneven engraving, or, in a worst-case scenario, burn your project to a crisp. So, don't skip this step, no matter how tempted you are. Trust me, I'm a pretty impatient gal who likes to try to rush things all the time, But this is one of those times where waiting does matter. Next, we need to seal everything. Since this wind chime is going to live outside on a porch by the lake, protecting the wood is really important. I'm using a sealant that contains spar urethane because it's designed for outdoor use and holds up much better against moisture, humidity, temperature changes, and UV exposure than a standard indoor sealant would. Outdoor projects expand and contract constantly with the weather, and spar urethane stays a little more flexible, which helps prevent cracking, peeling, and wear over time. Since we'll be working with UV resin next, I'm taping off the engraved side of the Windcatcher to help protect the finish. Resin has the darndest way of getting everywhere you don't want it, so this step helps minimize cleanup, sanding, and touch-up work later on. Now it's time to paint the ocean. There are a ton of ways to make resin ocean waves, but I like painting mine first before adding the resin. It gives the piece a solid base layer and adds depth, which really helps the final wave effect stand out. I'm using Ohuhu Nahuku acrylic markers here for this part. I picked these up recently, and they're quickly becoming one of my favorite paint markers to work with. They use an automatic ink flow system, so you don't have to constantly stop and pump the tip to get the paint moving again, which makes the process a lot smoother. They also have a brush tip, which makes it much easier to get into tight spaces without fighting the marker the whole time. But you can use whatever you've got on hand. Just make sure it's acrylic based, so it works well with the resin. Now we're going to create the beach. I'm a fan of texture and dimension, so I decided to go with a 3-dimensional beach for this project. I picked up a bag of sand from Amazon and mixed a small bit of it with UV resin to create a thick mixture. You'll want to make sure you're only adding a little resin at a time. We're aiming for the consistency of wet sandcastle sand. If you added too much resin, that's okay. Just add more sand little by little until you're happy with the consistency. Here, I've already gone ahead and applied the first layer of sand, and now I'm going back in with the second pass. I want to build up enough coverage so the beach has a solid base before moving on to my next step. The extra layering also helps the shoreline feel a little more natural once the resin waves go in. Next, it's time to decorate the beach. This little container comes with hundreds of natural mini seashells and even includes tiny starfish. I feel like the shells add a lot of detail to the piece and help bring the whole beach scene together. Also, I realized halfway through this that I forgot to put gloves on while working with resin. I do normally wear gloves for resin work, especially with repeated exposure, but my brain apparently clocked out for a minute during this step. So definitely make sure to wear those gloves, y'all. Now, we need to cure the beach layer. I'm using this small UV flashlight, which I love. It cures pretty fast, and it's so easy to maneuver around small objects. And just as a heads up, I'll be curing between every resin layer throughout this process. I realized while editing that somehow most of my curing footage disappeared into the void, so definitely make sure to do that. Next, we'll create the ocean. You might have seen this technique done on a river table before and wondered how they did it. The good news is that it's a whole lot easier than it looks. All it takes is resin, a good white pigment paste, and a heat gun, preferably one that has a flat nozzle attachment. There are a ton of options out there, but I'm using Resiner's heat gun, Let's Resin's UV resin, and Eye Candy's Satori white pigment paste. This combination makes creating the ocean wave lacy cell effect incredibly easy. The most frustrating part of creating resin ocean waves is typically the wait time. It's pretty common for resin artists to use a 24-hour two-part epoxy when creating these waves. That's an entire 24 hours that leaves open the possibility of the waves falling flat or dog hair getting in it. I said it before, and I'll say it again. I'm an impatient gal, and I definitely don't have time for that. That's why we're using UV resin, so we can make our fancy cells and lock them in before they try to escape. And we'll be doing it in layers. For the first layer, we're going to apply a thin coat of clear resin and make sure we spread it out as evenly as possible, paying close attention to the edges. Because the layer is pretty thin, it can take some coaxing to get the resin to spread out. I like to scoot and tap it around with a stick or a toothpick to get it moving where I want it to go. Here, I'm using a small squeeze bottle that is filled with UV resin and white pigment paste to draw a thin line along the water's edge. Then I add a second line slightly higher than the first. Next, it's time to create our first wave. I have my heat gun set on the lowest setting, and I'm using the flat attachment, which works great for making waves. The trick here is to position the heat gun at a 45-degree angle and allow the heat to push the white resin. Slow and steady is the way to go. I start at one end and slowly guide the heat gun along to the other end. Then, I add a slightly thicker line of white resin along the shoreline and top it with a line of clear resin and repeat the process. Once you're done, it's time to cure the layer and lock in that beautiful wave. Now it's time for the second layer. We're going to do the same thing we did the first time. If you see any bubbles popping up in the resin, just give them a quick pass with a lighter to get rid of them. For this wave, I added an even thicker line of white resin along the shoreline and skipped adding the line of clear resin on top. You want this wave to spread out at a slower pace so you have more control over where it's going. Once you're done, yep, you guessed it, lock that baby in. Now this is where I stopped. I was really happy with my results, but if you think you need another layer or two to make your perfect wave, go for it. The thing about ocean waves is that each one is unique. You will never see the same wave twice. Next, we remove the tape. Because we took the time to protect the bottom and sides, we have very little cleanup. But if your edges need a little work, you can either use one of those deburring tools, clear resin for a touch-up here and there, or you can sand and polish them by starting with a lower grit to smooth everything out, then working your way up through finer grits before polishing to bring the shine back. Then we'll move on to paint filling the engraved side. Because we sealed the wood, we don't have to worry about being particular here, we can just paint. Make sure you really get the paint into the engraved parts though. A couple passes here to really get the paint in the grooves wouldn't hurt. Then, we just wipe away the excess paint. I use a dry cloth to wipe away the majority of the excess, and then go back over it with a slightly damp cloth to remove the rest. Then we allow the paint inside the engraving to fully dry. Now, it's finally time to assemble the wind chime. You'll need a pair of scissors, some cording or string, a ruler, and your wind chime tubes. The set I picked up came with tubes ranging from 2 3/4 inches to 4.5 inches, which work really well for a smaller wind chime like this. First, we'll measure and cut the cording into 12-inch sections. The amount you'll need will depend on how many holes you have in your base piece. I ended up using about 18 feet of cording in total for mine, 1 foot per tube, 2 feet for the center section, and the rest for hanging. Then we'll string and knot the center hole. One cord will go up through the center and out the top of the base, where it'll be knotted underneath. The second cord will go down through the center hole and be knotted from the top. Next, we'll string and knot the holes along the outer edge of the base. These cords will eventually be tied together and used to hang the wind chime. Until then, you'll want to gather them up and clip them together so they stay out of the way while you work. After that, we'll string and attach the chime tubes. Once the tubes are ready to be attached, we'll feed both ends of the cord up through the hole, leaving the tube hanging about an inch below the base. Then we'll knot it right at the top of the base and move on to the next one. We'll repeat this process until all of the chime tubes are attached. Just make sure each tube is hanging evenly before moving on to the next one. Once the chimes are on, it's time to attach the clacker. I settled on hanging my clacker right around the center of the wind chime tubes. Then we'll attach the Windcatcher. I'd also recommend knotting the Windcatcher several times to help keep it secure in the wind. After that, we're in the home stretch. We'll gather the remaining cords we had clipped together and tie them up in a big knot, making sure to balance out how the wind chime is hanging. Lastly, we'll give it a haircut and go around and snip off all of the excess cord. And there you have it, a complete handmade wind chime build. I hope you have as much fun making yours as I did making this one. If you enjoy in-depth, step-by-step projects like this, please consider subscribing. I have a lot more builds lined up that I think you'll really enjoy. Until next time.